The alarm clock rang at 4:30 a.m., just like it had every weekday for the past 23 years. Samuel Washington rolled out of his small bed in the tiny apartment he shared with his wife, Rose. His joints creaked as he stood up, reminding him that 72 was not 29, but he never complained. Work was work, and Samuel was grateful to have it. Rose was already awake. Nice. Sitting at their small kitchen table with a cup of coffee and her Bible, she looked up at her husband with tired but loving eyes. "Morning, honey," she whispered, not wanting to wake their grandson, Marcus, who was sleeping on the couch. The boy was staying with them while his mother worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. "Morning, Rose," Samuel replied, kissing the top of her gray head. She had been by his side for 48 years, through good times and bad. When Samuel lost his factory job in the 1980s, Rose never made him feel ashamed. When they struggled to pay rent, she found ways to stretch every dollar. When their son died in a car accident 10 years ago, they held each other and somehow found the strength to keep going. Samuel put on his gray uniform and laced up his work boots. The same boots he had worn for 5 years, resold twice because new ones cost too much. He grabbed his lunch pail, leftover meatloaf, and a thermos of coffee, and headed out into the dark Chicago morning. The bus ride to downtown took 45 minutes. Samuel always sat in the same seat, 3rd row on the right side. He watched the city wake up through the window as they passed empty streets that would soon be filled with cars and people rushing to important places. Sometimes he wondered what it would feel like to be one of those people in expensive suits, carrying briefcases and talking on cell phones about big deals and important meetings. But Samuel was not bitter. His grandfather had been a sharecropper in Mississippi who never learned to read. His father had worked in a steel mill for 30 years and died at 58 with lungs full of metal dust. Samuel had finished high school, the first in his family to do so, and that was something to be proud of. He could read, write, and think for himself. That was more than many people had. The Preston Industries building stood 50 stories tall in the heart of downtown Chicago. It was made of glass and steel, reaching toward the sky like a giant finger pointing at heaven.
Ow.
Samuel had been cleaning this building since 1998 when he was 49 years old and desperate for steady work after the factory closed. He entered through the loading dock at 5:45 a.m. "Morning, Sam," called out James, a young black man who reminded Samuel of his son at that age. James had been working security for 3 years and always had time for a friendly word. "Morning, James. How's your baby girl doing?" He remembered when James's daughter was born 2 years ago, how the young father had been so nervous and excited. "She's walking now, getting into everything. Keeps us up all night," James laughed. "But she's perfect, you know?" He knew. He remembered when his own son took his first steps. How proud and scared he had felt watching that little boy stumble across the living room into his arms. Samuel changed into his work. Clothes in the small janitor's closet on the ground floor. The closet was cramped and smelled like cleaning supplies, but it was his space. He had organized it perfectly over the years, every mop, bucket, and bottle in its proper place. On the wall he had taped a small photo of Rose and Marcus and a faded picture of his son in his army uniform. His work cart was loaded and ready. Samuel pushed it toward the elevator, beginning his daily journey through the building. He started on the lower floors and worked his way up, cleaning offices, bathrooms, and conference rooms. The work was not glamorous, but Samuel took pride in doing it well. Every surface he cleaned was spotless. Every trash can he emptied was wiped down inside and out. As the morning progressed, the building came alive. Elevators hummed with activity as hundreds of employees arrived for work. Men and women in expensive suits walked quickly through the hallways, talking on phones or checking tablets. They moved around Samuel like water flowing around a rock in a stream. "Excuse me," they would say without looking at him, stepping around his cart as if it were an obstacle instead of a tool. Being used by a human being, Samuel had long ago stopped being hurt by their indifference. He understood that in their world, he was invisible. They saw the uniform, not the man wearing it. They saw a job function, not a person with dreams, fears, and 48 years of marriage to a woman who still made his heart skip when she smiled. But being invisible had its advantages. People said things around Samuel that they would never say if they remembered he was there. As he emptied trash cans and wiped down desks, he heard conversations about business deals, office politics, and company problems. He learned which executives were having affairs, which departments were struggling, and which clients were unhappy. Samuel was naturally curious and had a good memory. Over the years, he had developed a deep understanding of how Preston Industries worked. He knew that the company made parts for construction equipment, that they had clients all over the world, and that their biggest competitor was a firm in Germany. He understood profit margins, quarterly reports, and market strategies better than many of the junior executives who rushed past him each day. During his lunch break, Samuel often sat in the small employee cafeteria with other maintenance workers. There was Maria, who cleaned the upper floors and spoke English with a thick accent, but always shared her homemade tamales. There was Eddie, an older white man who had been a plumber for 40 years and told the funniest stories about the strange things he found in office walls. And there was Betty, who ran the cafeteria and made sure everyone had enough to eat, even when money was tight. These were Samuel's people. They respected each other's work and looked out for each other's families. When Maria's husband was in the hospital, Samuel organized a collection to help with medical bills. When Eddie's truck broke down, Samuel gave him rides to work for 2 weeks. When Betty's grandson was arrested, Samuel sat with her and listened, while she cried. But upstairs, in the world of marble floors and mahogany desks, Samuel remained a ghost. The executives who made million-dollar decisions had no idea that the quiet man who cleaned their offices had insights that could help their struggling company. As the workday ended and the building emptied, Samuel continued his rounds. Cleaned the executive conference rooms, polished the brass fixtures, and made sure everything was perfect for the next day. Sometimes he found important documents left behind on tables or in trash cans. Being curious, he would glance at them before disposing of them properly. At 6:30 p.m., Samuel clocked out and began his journey home. The bus was crowded with tired working people heading back to their families. Samuel sat in his usual seat and watched the city lights flicker on as darkness fell. He thought about Rose, who would have dinner waiting, and Marcus, who would want help with his homework. Samuel Washington was invisible to most of the world, but he was not blind. He saw everything, understood more than people realized, and cared deeply about the place where he spent most of his waking hours. Little did anyone know that this invisible man would soon become the most important voice in the room. 3 months after Samuel's quiet routine had been the same for years, things began to change at Preston Industries. The change was subtle at first, like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. But Samuel noticed everything, and he could feel trouble coming. It started with the executives staying later at the office. Samuel was used to the building being mostly empty by 7 in the evening. But now, lights stayed on until 9 or 10 o'clock. The 49th floor, where the top bosses worked, was always busy. Samuel could hear voices through closed doors as he cleaned nearby offices. The voices sounded tense and worried. Richard Preston, 3, the big boss and grandson of the man who started the company, looked different these days. Samuel had seen him many times over the years, always walking fast and talking on his phone. But now Mr. Preston's face was pale and tired. His expensive suits looked wrinkled, and his usually perfect hair was messy. Samuel noticed that Mr. Preston's trash can was full of antacid, tablets, and empty coffee cups. The other executives looked stressed too. Mrs. Margaret Hartwell was on the board of directors, had been crying. Samuel could tell because her makeup was smudged and there were tissues in her wastebasket. Mr. Thomas Chen, the money manager, was working so late that he had started sleeping on the couch in his office. Samuel found blankets and pillows there when he came to clean. But the biggest change, Samuel noticed, was in the regular employees. The people who worked in accounting, sales, and customer service were scared. They whispered in the hallways and gathered in small groups during lunch breaks. Samuel heard pieces of their conversations as he walked by with his cleaning cart. "Did you hear about the meeting yesterday?" One woman asked another. "We're talking about layoffs," a man in a tie said quietly. "My friend in HR says they might close the whole Denver office," someone else whispered. Samuel's heart felt heavy as he listened to these worried voices. These people had families to feed and bills to pay, just like him. If the company was in trouble, it would hurt everyone who worked there. The first big sign of serious trouble came on a Tuesday morning in March. Samuel was cleaning the 20th floor when he heard shouting from the conference room. He had never heard executives yell at each other before. They were always polite and professional, even when they disagreed. But this was different. Through the closed door, Samuel could hear Mr. Preston's voice louder than usual. "We cannot lose Meridian Corporation. They've been our biggest client for 15 years. Another voice, which Samuel recognized as Mr. Chen, responded angrily. "It's too late, Richard. They signed with Fisher Industries yesterday. The contract is worth $12 million, and now it's gone." Samuel stopped mopping and listened more carefully. Meridian Corporation was indeed their biggest client. He had seen their name on documents and heard executives talking about them for years. If they had left Preston Industries, that was very bad news. A woman's voice, probably Mrs. Hartwell, said something Samuel couldn't hear clearly. Then Mr. Preston shouted, "I don't care what excuses they gave. We need to find out why they really left and fix it." The meeting continued for 2 hours. Samuel finished cleaning the floor and moved to other areas, but he could still hear the angry voices. When the meeting finally ended, the executives walked out looking defeated. Some of them had red faces, and others looked like they wanted to cry that evening. Samuel found something that made his stomach turn. While emptying Mr. Preston's trash can, he saw a crumpled letter with the Meridian Corporation logo. The letter had been thrown away, but Samuel could still read most of it. The letter was from Ms. Rosa Rodriguez, the main contact person at Meridian Corporation. She was writing to explain why they were ending their business relationship with Preston Industries. Samuel read the letter carefully, and what he learned made him feel sick. Ms. Rodriguez wrote that Meridian Corporation had tried many times to discuss problems with their orders. They had called and sent emails, but no one at Preston Industries had listened to their concerns. When they finally got meetings, they were passed from one person to another, and no one seemed to care about solving their problems. The letter said that Meridian Corporation felt like Preston Industries treated them badly. They felt ignored and unimportant. Ms. Rodriguez wrote that Fisher Industries, their new partner, spent time understanding their needs and made them feel valued as a customer. Samuel folded the letter and put it in his pocket. He knew he probably shouldn't take it, but something told him it might be important later. Over the next few weeks, Samuel noticed more bad signs. The company's stock price was falling. He heard employees talking about it in the break room. There were rumors that another big client, Hammond Industries, was also thinking about leaving. Samuel saw Mr. Peterson, the sales manager, throwing away emails from Hammond Industries without reading them carefully. The mood in the building became darker each day. People walked slower and talked less. The usual laughter from the break rooms was replaced by worried whispers. Samuel saw employees updating their resumes and taking long phone calls in private corners. One evening, while cleaning the executive floor, Samuel overheard a phone conversation that made his blood run cold. Mr. Preston was talking to someone about workforce reduction and closing unnecessary departments. Samuel realized that hundreds of people were about to lose their jobs. Samuel thought about his friends in the building. Lydia, who sent money to her family in Mexico every month. Eddie, who was only 3 years away from retirement. Betty, who had worked in the cafeteria for 20 years and treated everyone like family. These good people were going to suffer because the company was failing. But Samuel also thought about what he had learned from the Meridian Corporation letter and from all the conversations he had overheard. The company wasn't failing because their products were bad or their prices were too high. They were failing because they had forgotten how to treat people, both their customers and their employees, with respect and care. Samuel had worked for many companies in his life, and he had seen this pattern before. When bosses stopped listening to their workers and customers, businesses always got into trouble. The solution seemed obvious to him, but he was just a janitor who would listen to an old black man who pushed a mop for a living. Samuel wrote The bus home that night, he thought about his grandson Marcus. The boy was smart and had dreams of going to college. Samuel had been saving money for years to help pay for Marcus's education. If Preston Industries failed and Samuel lost his job, those dreams might be impossible, but Samuel also thought about all the other families who would be hurt. The single mothers who worked in accounting, the young men in the warehouse who were supporting their parents, the older workers who were too old to find new jobs easily. Samuel made a decision that night. He might be invisible to the executives, but he could see what they could not. He understood what was really wrong with the company, and he knew how to fix it. The question was whether he would have the courage to speak up when the time came. The storm clouds were gathering, and Samuel Washington was about to step out of the shadows. Friday morning arrived with dark clouds covering Chicago's sky. Samuel looked out his apartment window and felt like the weather matched his mood. For weeks he had been carrying the weight of what he knew about Preston Industries. The company was dying, and soon hundreds of good people would lose their jobs. Samuel had barely slept the night before. He kept thinking about the emergency board meeting scheduled for 9 o'clock that morning. Rose had noticed his restlessness and asked him what was wrong, but Samuel couldn't find the words to explain. How could he tell his wife that he was thinking about doing something that could get him fired? "You look worried, honey," Rose said as she poured his coffee. "Everything okay at work?" Samuel forced a smile. "Just thinking about some things, that's all." Marcus was already at the kitchen table, eating cereal and reading a book for school. The boy was so smart, always reading and asking questions about everything. Samuel had promised to help pay for his college, but if he lost his job today, that promise might be broken. The bus ride to work felt longer than usual. Samuel sat in his regular seat, but his mind was racing. He thought about all the conversations he had overheard, all the documents he had seen, and all the worried faces of his coworkers. He thought about Ms. Rodriguez's letter explaining why Meridian Corporation had left. He thought about how the executives kept making the same mistakes over and over again at the building. Samuel went through his usual routine, but everything felt different. He changed into his work clothes and loaded his cart, but his hands were shaking slightly. James, the security guard, noticed something was wrong. "You feeling all right, Sam?" "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine, son." "I'm just tired," Samuel replied, but he wasn't fine. He was scared and excited and worried all at the same time. Samuel started his cleaning rounds on the lower floors, but he couldn't concentrate on his work. He kept thinking about the board meeting happening 49 floors above him. The executives were up there right now, trying to save the company. But Samuel knew they were probably making things worse. At 9:15 a.m., Samuel was mopping the 35th floor when he heard something that made him stop. The building's ventilation system carried sound from the upper floors, and he could hear shouting coming from the executive conference room. The board meeting was not going well. Samuel put down his mop and listened carefully. He couldn't make out the exact words, but the voices were angry and desperate. These were powerful people who were used to being in control, but now they sounded scared and confused. For the next hour, Samuel tried to continue his work, but his mind kept wandering to the meeting upstairs. Imagine the board members sitting around their big table, arguing about what to do. They probably had charts and graphs and reports, but Samuel knew they were missing the most important information. At 10:25 a.m., Samuel made a decision that would change his life forever. He parked his cleaning cart in a supply closet and walked to the elevator. His heart was beating fast as he pressed the button for the 49th floor. The elevator seemed to move in slow motion as it climbed higher and higher. Samuel had never been to the executive floor during business hours. He had only cleaned there after everyone went home. The hallways were different during the day, brighter and more intimidating. The carpet was thick and expensive, and the walls were covered with paintings and awards. As the elevator doors opened, Samuel expected to see the security guard, who usually watched the executive floor during important meetings. But the guard's desk was empty. Samuel remembered that Carl, the guard, always took his coffee break at 10:30. This was Samuel's chance. Samuel walked down the hallway toward the conference room. His work boots made soft sounds on the thick carpet. He passed the offices of executives he had been cleaning for 23 years, but had never spoken to. Each step felt like a mile. The conference room was at the end of the hall. Samuel could hear the voices more clearly now. Mr. Preston was speaking loudly about cutting costs and laying off workers. Mrs. Hartwell was arguing that they should sell the company before it was too late. Mr. Chen was reading numbers that proved how much money they were losing. Samuel stood outside the door for a long moment. His whole body was shaking now. He thought about Rose and Marcus and all the dreams they had for the future. He thought about Maria and Eddie and Betty and all his other friends who would lose their jobs. He thought about the letter from Ms. Rodriguez and all the other customers who had left because nobody at Preston Industries listened to them. Samuel raised his hand and knocked on the door twice. The voices inside stopped immediately. Then Samuel did something he had never done in 23 years of working at Preston Industries. He opened the conference room door and walked inside. The silence was complete. 12 people in expensive suits sat around a huge table covered with papers and laptops. They all stared at Samuel like he was an alien from another planet. Some of their mouths were actually hanging open in shock. Richard Preston III was sitting at the head of the table, and his face went from pale to red in seconds. "What the hell?" he muttered, then looked around at the other board members as if to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. Margaret Hartwell actually gasped and put her hand over her heart. She looked at Samuel like he was a dangerous criminal who had broken into her house. Thomas Chen started to stand up from his chair, probably planning to escort Samuel out of the room. But something in Samuel's calm expression made him sit back down. "Excuse me," Mr. Preston said, his voice cold and angry. "This is a private meeting. You need to leave immediately." Several board members chuckled nervously. Samuel could see what they were thinking. They saw an old black man in a janitor's uniform who had obviously gotten lost and wandered into the wrong room. To them, he was a mistake that needed to be corrected. Quickly, one board member whispered something to the person next to him, and they both smirked. Another woman shook her head like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. They were all looking at Samuel like he was a child who didn't understand where he belonged. But Samuel didn't move. For 72 years, people had underestimated him. For 23 years, he had been invisible in this building. For months, he'd watched the company destroy itself while he stayed silent. Not today. Samuel stood up straighter and looked directly at Richard Preston III. His voice was calm and steady when he spoke, but every word carried the weight of decades, of experience and wisdom. "My name is Samuel Washington, and I've been cleaning this building for 23 years. I know I don't belong in this room, and I know you think I'm just an old janitor who got lost." The room was so quiet that Samuel could hear the air conditioning system humming. "But I also know this company is about to die," Samuel continued, "and I think I know why." The chuckling stopped. The smirks disappeared. 12 pairs of eyes focused on Samuel with sudden attention. For the first time in his life, Samuel Washington was no longer invisible. The silence in the conference room stretched like a tightrope ready to snap. Samuel could feel 12 pairs of eyes studying him, trying to figure out if he was crazy or dangerous or both. His heart was beating so loud he was sure everyone could hear it, but his voice had been steady and calm. That surprised even him. Richard Preston III's face was getting redder by the second. His hands were gripping the edge of the conference table so hard his knuckles were white. "Security," he shouted, reaching for the phone on the table. "I want this man removed from the building immediately." But before Mr. Preston could dial, Samuel raised his hand and spoke again, with something in his voice, a quiet dignity, that had been earned through decades of hard work and careful observation that made even the angry CEO pause. "Please," Samuel said, looking directly at Mr. Preston, "give me 5 minutes. If what I have to say doesn't make sense, I'll leave quietly and never bother you again. But if I'm right, those 5 minutes might save this company and 800 jobs." Thomas Chen was halfway out of his chair, ready to escort Samuel to the door. But something made him stop. Maybe it was the way Samuel stood, straight and proud, despite his simple uniform. Maybe it was the intelligence in his eyes that didn't match what they expected from a janitor. Or maybe it was the mention of 800 jobs that reminded them why they were all so worried. This is ridiculous, Margaret Hartwell whispered to the man sitting next to her. We're wasting time listening to the cleaning man. But Dr. Patricia Williams, the newest member of the board, leaned forward with curiosity. She had joined the board only 6 months ago and was known for asking tough questions. What did you mean when you said you know why the company's dying? She asked Samuel. Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook. It was old and worn, with a rubber band holding it together. Several board members looked at it with confusion, as if they couldn't imagine what a janitor might write in a notebook. For 23 years, Samuel began, I've been invisible in this building. People talk around me like I'm not there. They leave important papers on their desks when I come to clean. They have phone conversations while I'm emptying their trash cans, and I've been paying attention. Samuel opened his notebook and flipped through several pages covered with neat handwriting. You lost Meridian Corporation 3 weeks ago, he said, looking at Mr. Preston. Your biggest client? $12 million a year. The board members exchanged glances. This information wasn't public knowledge. How could the custodian know about it? You're about to lose Hammond Industries. 2, Samuel continued, though most of you don't know that yet. Mr. Peterson, the sales manager who was sitting in the corner taking notes, dropped his pen. How could you possibly know that? He asked, his voice shaky. Samuel looked at him calmly. Because I saw the email from Mr. Davis at Hammond Industries in your trash can yesterday, Mr. Peterson. The one where he said they were exploring other options because they felt ignored and unappreciated. The room was getting quieter, and Samuel could see that he now had their complete attention. Even Mrs. Hartwell had stopped whispering and was listening carefully. I also know, Samuel continued, that Morrison Tech canceled their contract last month, and Peterson Manufacturing is 3 months behind on payments because nobody returns their phone calls. Dr. Williams sat up straighter. Those are confidential client matters. How do you know all this? Samuel's voice remained calm and respectful. Because I clean your offices every night, ma'am. I empty your trash cans and see the letters you throw away. I mop the floors while you have phone conversations. I wipe down the conference tables where you leave important documents. He paused and looked around the room. And what I've learned is that your problem isn't your products or your prices. Your problem is that you've forgotten how to treat people like human beings. The silence was so complete that Samuel could hear someone's watch ticking. Samuel reached into his other pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the letter from Ms. Rodriguez at Meridian Corporation that he had found in Mr. Preston's trash weeks ago. This is from Ms. Rodriguez at Meridian Corporation, Samuel said, unfolding the letter carefully. She tried to explain why they were leaving. But I found this letter in your trash can, Mr. Preston. Did you ever read it? Mr. Preston's face went pale. How did you? Ms. Rodriguez wrote that Meridian Corporation called your company 15 times in 3 months trying to discuss problems with their orders. Samuel read from the letter. Each time, they were transferred from person to person. Nobody listened to their concerns. Nobody cared about solving their problems. Samuel looked up from the letter. She wrote that when they finally got meetings, your people acted like Meridian. Corporations should be grateful for your attention instead of the other way around. Thomas Chun leaned forward. Let me see that letter. Samuel handed it to him. Mr. Chen read it quickly, his expression growing more serious with each line. My God, he whispered. She's right. We treated them terribly. Out. Samuel opened his notebook. Again, it's not just Meridian Corporation. Mrs. Chen, in your accounting department, has been trying to tell someone for months that the billing system confuses customers. But nobody listens to her because she's not management. He flipped a page. Jerry in Shippen knows exactly why deliveries are always late, but when he tried to speak up in meetings, he was told to stay in his lane and worry about his own job. Dr. Williams was writing notes now. What else? Martha, in customer service, keeps a list of client complaints, but nobody in management ever asks to see it. She told me last week that the same problems come up over and over again, but nobody wants to hear about them. Samuel looked directly at Mr. Preston. Sir, you have smart, hard-working people in this company who could solve these problems if anyone would listen to them. But instead, you have meetings like this one, where you talk about cutting costs and firing people, without ever asking why your customers are really leaving. The board members were looking at each other with expressions of surprise and shame. They were beginning to understand that they had been so focused on numbers and profits that they had forgotten about the people who made those numbers possible. Samuel closed his notebook and stood up straighter. I'm 72 years old, and I've been watching people my whole life. Rich or poor, black or white, executive or janitor, people want the same things. They want to be heard, respected, and treated fairly. He looked around the room one more time. This company forgot that somewhere along the way, your employees don't feel heard, your customers don't feel respected. And now everyone is paying the price. The room was completely silent. Samuel had said what he came to say. But instead of the anger and dismissal he had expected, he saw something different in their faces. He saw recognition, understanding, and maybe even hope. Richard Preston III slowly put down the phone he had been holding. For the first time in months, he looked like he might have found an answer to his company's problems. Mr. Washington, he said quietly, would you be willing to stay a little longer? Samuel looked around the conference room and saw something he had never seen before in 23 years at Preston Industries. The 12 most powerful people in the company were looking at him, really looking at him, as if his words mattered. The change in their faces was remarkable. The anger and dismissal from minutes ago had been replaced by curiosity and something that looked like hope. Richard. Preston III gestured to an empty chair at the conference table. Please, Mr. Washington, have a seat. Samuel hesitated for a moment. He had never sat at this table before. In fact, he had never sat in the same room as these people during business hours. But he pulled out the chair and sat down, placing his worn notebook on the polished wood surface. Dr. Patricia Williams was the first to speak. Mr. Washington, you mentioned that employees throughout the company have solutions to our problems, but nobody listens to them. Can you give us more specific examples? Samuel opened his notebook and flipped through several pages. Yes, ma'am. Last month, I was cleaning the break room when I heard Mrs. Chen from accounting talking to her coworker. She said that customers call her department confused about their bills almost every day. The billing statements are written in language that's hard to understand, and they don't clearly show what customers are paying for. Looked at Thomas Chen, the CFO. Mrs. Chen, I believe she's your wife. Mr. Chen has created a simple, clear billing format that she thinks would solve the problem. But when she tried to suggest it to her supervisor, she was told that the current system works fine and she should focus on her own tasks. Thomas Chen's face turned red with embarrassment. I had no idea Sarah was trying to help with that. We get complaints about billing confusion every week. Your wife is a smart woman, sir, Samuel said kindly. She cares about this company and wants to help it succeed. But she feels like nobody values her ideas because she's not in management. Margaret Hartwell leaned forward. What about the delivery problems you mentioned? Samuel turned another page in his notebook. Jerry Martinez in the shipping department. He's worked there for 8 years and knows that system better than anyone. He told me that deliveries are late because the warehouse scheduling system doesn't account for traffic patterns or construction delays around the city. Samuel looked at his notes. Jerry has studied the delivery routes and created a new schedule that would solve most of the delays. He even tested it during his lunch breaks by driving the routes himself. But when he presented his idea at a department meeting, he was told that warehouse workers should worry about loading trucks, not planning routes. The board members were writing notes now, looking more interested with each story Samuel told and the customer service issues. Dr. Williams asked. Martha Henderson has been answering customer calls for 12 years. She keeps detailed records of every complaint, every problem, and every suggestion customers make. She has patterns and solutions that could help this company understand what clients really need. Samuel paused and looked directly at Richard Preston III. But Martha told me that management never asks for her input. When she tried to share her findings with her supervisor, she was told that customer service workers should solve problems, not analyze them. The room was quiet as the board members absorbed this information. Finally, Mr. Preston spoke. Washington, it sounds like we have good people with good ideas throughout the company, but our management structure prevents those ideas from reaching decision makers. That's exactly right, sir, Samuel replied. But it's not just about ideas. It's about respect. Your employees feel like their experience and knowledge don't matter to the company. And when employees feel unimportant, they stop caring about their work. Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out another piece of paper. This is an email I found in the trash from Ms. Rodriguez at Meridian Corporation. She sent it to 3 different people here, but I don't think anyone ever responded. He handed the paper to Dr. Williams, who read it aloud. Ms. Rodriguez wrote, "We have been trying for 2 months to discuss concerns about the project timeline. Each time we call, we are transferred to different departments. No one seems to have authority to make decisions or address our concerns. We are beginning to feel that Preston Industries does not value our partnership." The board members looked uncomfortable as they heard these words. "The same thing happens with your employees," Samuel continued. "When Jerry tried to improve delivery schedules, he was told to stay in his lane. When Mrs. Chen tried to fix billing problems, she was dismissed. When Martha tried to share customer feedback, she was ignored. People stop trying to help when they feel like their efforts don't matter." Samuel stood up and walked to the window overlooking the city. "I've worked for a lot of companies in my life. I've seen businesses succeed and fail. The ones that succeed are the ones where everyone feels like their work is important and their voices are heard." He turned back to face the board. "Preston Industries has 800 employees. That's 800 people with different experiences, different ideas, and different ways of solving problems. But right now, you're only listening to 12 people in this room." Richard Preston III was quiet for a long moment, thinking about what Samuel had said. Finally, he spoke. "Mr. Washington, if you were running this company, what would you do first?" Samuel sat back down and opened his notebook to a page near the back. "Sir, I've been thinking about that for weeks. First, I would talk to the employees who deal with customers every day, not just their supervisors, but the people who actually answer the phones and handle the complaints." He looked at his notes. "Second, I would call Ms. Rodriguez and the other customers who left. I would apologize for not listening to them and ask what it would take to earn their business back." Samuel turned another page. "Third, I would create a way for employees to share ideas without going through layers of management. Some of your best solutions are probably sitting in the heads of people you've never talked to." Dr. Williams was writing rapidly. "What else?" "Fourth, I would make sure that when customers call with problems, they can talk to someone who has the authority to solve those problems. It's not someone who has to ask their supervisor who has to ask their supervisor." Samuel closed his notebook and looked around the table. "But most importantly, I would remember that this company is not just about making money. It's about people. The people who work here, the people who buy your products, and the people and their families who depend on both." The conference room was completely silent for several minutes. Then Richard Preston III stood up and extended his hand to Samuel. "Mr. Washington," he said, "I think this board meeting just became a lot more interesting. Would you be willing to help us figure out how to fix this company?" Samuel shook the CEO's hand and smiled. "Sir, I've been waiting 23 years for someone to ask me that question." For the first time in months, everyone in the room looked hopeful. The Invisible Man had become the most important voice in the company, and Preston Industries was about to learn what happened when you finally started listening to the people who had been there all along. Outside the conference room windows, the storm clouds were breaking apart and sunlight was beginning to shine through.